Hi there. So, Jordan's World. I first had the idea for Jordan's World in about 2015. I had finished up doing Mindfire for the most part. It still needed some edits, but I was ready to go ahead and try something new. So, with Jordan's World, I wanted to take my first stab at fantasy, but I'd never done fantasy before. I'd read fantasy. I had I knew most of the tropes and things like that, but I wanted to make it my own. I wanted to make it different. And so, of course, it had to involve aliens, because what fantasy story doesn't involve being abducted by aliens and taken to another planet, Because, yeah. So, it didn't take me too long to figure out that this was science fantasy and not just your run-of-the-mill elf king conquest story or something. No. So, anyway, I got the premise for it, and the idea started building over time, and I knew that I wanted to have a lead female as the protagonist, and I wanted to have her be in roughly the same age range. Basically, what I write for is what's now called new adult, which is essentially 18 to 30 in age range. Now, people younger can read it and people older can read it, but that's more or less who I target to. And I found that works because there's room for development as a character, and there's just a lot of things that happen, to all of us in that time range. So anyway, yes, it turned into a science fantasy. Another interesting thing about it is that I originally started it out as a serial fantasy on Wattpad. And so I was doing about 1,000 to 1,500 words per chapter, and releasing them pretty much weekly on Wattpad, and that didn't work so well. Now, nothing against Wattpad. Wattpad works for a lot of people, and I think it's great for people just starting out, but it also, how can I say, it just didn't click with me very well. And so I decided to pull Jordan's World off of Wattpad, and I decided to go ahead and just, go through the chapters again. I've done like 21 chapters at this point, but I went through them and I made it so that they flowed as chapters, and they didn't have restrictions on them the same as they had previously, and that worked a whole lot better. And so and I got more of the science fantasy elements of it, made sure that it didn't have any of the normal tropes, and I got to focus a lot more on characterization, which is what I wanted to do, because this was starting from scratch. This was, none of my previous characters. This had nothing to do with any of my previous comics or anything. This was not based on a comic. This was just brand spanking new, and that's how I wanted it to be. But I knew by the time I got about halfway into it that this was going to be more than one book. This had enough story for more than one book, and it actually ends up having enough story for a trilogy. And so I really enjoyed the initial formation of it, and I invited my wife to edit it once I'd completed the first draft, and we'll talk more in just a minute. So, Jordan's World is about Jordan Lewis. At the time that she is abducted by extraterrestrials, she's 17 years old. Her mother is taken as well, and they are taken through basically a spatial warp technology, so there's no spaceships involved, to another world that is Earth-like in its environment, in terms of having oxygen that they can breathe, and water they can drink and stuff like that, but it's very different from Earth. Algorand is more or less bereft of modern technology. It's a lot more tribal in the way that the peoples are, and there's different races and there's different species and animals and things, but the people there are humanoid, but they do look a little different depending on the race of the people. And Jordan and her mother are taken in by a group of people called the Makta, and Jordan and her mother have to learn their language, their culture, and everything. They are accepted into their tribe, but they have to learn how to be Makta, and because there's no guarantee that they're ever going to be able to go back to Earth, and it's not easy. It's a harsher environment. It's colder there, and a lot of things go on, but it's interesting, and it shows sort of human survival and things like that. But as I mentioned before, this is Christian fiction, so something happens along the way that Jordan has, I guess the best way to put it is that she has a spiritual experience. She has a near-death experience, and basically God gives her a choice, and based on her answer to that choice, that affects things completely going forward. So that was very interesting. It was very it was kind of difficult to set up, because we've got this fantasy environment, we have this science fiction environment, if you will, but the theme of Jordan's world is that God reigns over the entire universe. It's not like he's limited to Earth or something. And so I wanted to show that, and I wanted to see the practical use of that in this story through Jordan and the things that happened to her. So it was very interesting to write. It was interesting to use that as a mechanism for change and growth and development in Jordan. So we will continue on in the next video. Okay, so things take a turn for the interesting in Jordan's world when Jordan learns that the aliens that abducted her, that she calls the abductors, may actually live on the other side of Algorand. So by this time, Jordan has become a huntress, and the chiefess of the tribe okays Jordan to go with 3 of her fellow hunters to try and get answers from those aliens if they're there. And so that means they're going to have to cross terrain spanning a world, and that is what takes up a lot of the first book. But that's not all that just takes up the first book. It takes quite a few twists and turns along the way, and we get to meet some of those different tribes and peoples and things, and we get to learn about the world itself, and we get to learn about Jordan, who she is when faced with different situations, whether they're life-threatening, life-changing, or just what would you do under these circumstances. So it makes for an interesting story. I think that it's a compelling story, and you learn a little bit about what makes Algorand unique. They have their own history, they have their own storytelling, they have their own legends, if you will. And those legends, like all legends, are based on some manner of fact. So I realize that's a little vague right now, but I don't want to spoil things for you. I want you to enjoy this and have fun with it, and learn who Jordan is and who she's becoming, and what God has to do with all of this. And then along the way, we also get to meet Jordan's best friend, who is a Makta. Her name is Zaska, and Then there's also Bhopal, who is a hunter, but he's the son of the chiefess. And then there's also Raban, and Raban is a fellow hunter, but he's also Zaska's mate or husband. And so they're an interesting group of people. I think you'll like them. Oh, can't leave this out. There's dragons, alien dragons. You've got to check out the alien dragons. I'll just leave it at that for now. Okay, more soon. Dragons. Yep. Yeah, they're dragons and alien dragons, and they breathe black fire that can destroy pretty much anything. They're rather large dragons and can have pretty bad tempers. The people from Algorand called them Deathwings. Yeah. And they appear in the second book as well. They actually have a pretty cool role in the second book. Speaking of which, the second book is called Jordan's Arrow. And there will be an excerpt from Jordan's Arrow at the very back of Jordan's World. Kind of give you a little taste of what's to come in the second book. And there's a third book called Jordan's Deliverance. And I'll have to stay tight-lipped about that, except to say that Jordan's Arrow takes place about 6 years after Jordan's World, and Jordan's Deliverance takes place considerably later. So, give you something to look forward to there. Anyway, I don't know what else I can tell you without giving spoilers. The Christian theme does run throughout the series, but it's really not in your face. The way that I was inspired to give reverence to God and His Son Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit weave throughout the story. So my strong effort was to avoid any sense of being preachy or hit you over the head or anything like that. I wanted this to be a relevant, meaningful aspect of the story, and in the end, the main point. So, sorry if that sounds vague right now, but when you read the story, I think you'll know what I mean. Anyway, that's that for now, and I'll tell you some more in the next video. Okay, so I think at this point it's fair to ask, do you have any questions about Jordan's World, or the Jordan series, or any of the characters, or the world Algorand, or any aspect of it? Now's the time to ask. I will be happy to answer your questions. And thank you so much for joining me on this little journey. Thank you for your time, and have a wonderful day.